Hi, and welcome to Legally Insane News. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. Find and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell, and head over to legallyinsanefilms.com to listen to my other podcasts, to read my books and articles, to check out my photos from around the world, and to watch my documentary films. Again, that's legallyinsanefilms.com. My recent article on the death of Patrick Lyoya at the hands of former police officer Christopher Schorr led me to the thoughts that I had when I was writing this article, and it's more of a story of nostalgia in the face of our changing times, but it's as relevant now as it was when my memories of a much less complex world were still being formed back in high school. When my dad was growing up in the 1950s, there were certainly violent crimes like rape and murder, but they were so sensational and outrageous that news of these instances traveled far and wide and basically scared the crap out of the entire country. Moving forward a generation, when I was growing up, we heard of violent crimes as well, certainly as prevalent as my dad's generation, if not more, and many of us even experienced that firsthand. That firsthand experience, and I happen to be one of these individuals, this is because I frankly, this is just an opinion, but I think it's with the increase in the population came an increase in cases of violence. I mean, you increase the population of rabbits, you increase the cases of rabbit cancer. I mean, it just comes with an increased number of people, and certainly the population of the United States is much greater now than it was in the 1950s. And I think that's attributable to why we're seeing more cases. I'm sure there are several contributing factors to this, but I guess I'm just speaking of population in the context that I think things were simpler as a result of that same number as well. But a presiding assumption from my own humble perspective is that the cases increased with population, of course, but also for that complexity that came with that population increase. And I think that's because society as a whole has become more. There have been more requirements of society as that complexity has grown in its social structure, in the things that are available to do now that weren't around in my dad's generation. There are just more expectations, and certainly I was going to say the government, but I mean, I guess the government too. I think that when my dad was growing up, the man was the only person in the family expected to work. In fact, it was considered an honor to support and rear one's family through their ability to bring home the bacon. I mean, phrases like that came out of that generation. But I think the government capitalized on the idea that, well, we can, if we make things just a little bit more expensive, then we can have two incomes that we can tax, right? I mean, I think the government had its own agenda. I don't want to get too far off onto that tangent, but I think that there are a lot of reasons that things grew in complexity. And I think that's just one small sampling of what those might be. And the word complex that I keep using here, I'm using that to specifically identify that the structure and the imperatives of society as a whole have grown complex at a rate that I think exponentially surpasses society's ability to adapt to that cadence and scope of change. And I think that might be a little bit confusing. So, in other words, I don't think that our ability to cope with change is evolving at a speed necessary to keep up with the social changes and expectations that we're placing on ourselves. And I don't mean individual placement of expectations. I mean society as a collective whole places on itself. And I think I, pointed out a few of those just now. I'll leave that and get back to the main point here. But we see examples of this all over the place where in the past there would be, for instance, like the Vietnam War, right? And people would come out and protest about that conflict until they saw results. Or the women's lib movement. And, women would dedicate their years of their lives to the effort. Today we have wars piled up on top of financial crises, which are piled up on top of mob style riots following an unjust court ruling, or the beating of someone by cops, on top of huge fires throughout the like California or something, made worse by global warming, and this is kind of piled on top of a season of ultra-violent mass shootings, right? Or a terrorist event somewhere in the world. I mean, they just didn't have that type of complexity piled up on top of, just campaigning against the Vietnam War. I mean, there were lots. I mean, I wasn't even alive during that period, but I guess what I'm generating this kind of a memorial experience from was, when you look in that time period, there were so many fewer headlines of things that people were doing, in the way that they were dealing with the complexities of social and societal issues. And I think if you add concentrated efforts at internal conflict that are generated from that complexity, and I'm talking about things like, the incel community, MGTOW, Antifa, aggressive groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and then you consider all of the terror events that are taking up more headlines lately. There's just so much more for people to keep up with. Now, perhaps someday I'll write about my experience in the active shooter scenario that went down at my school. I believe I was in 3rd or 4th grade. My brother was in 5th or 6th grade. That experience shaped both of our lives, certainly, and is a prime example of what I'm calling an increase in both statistical probabilities of involvement in violent crime, as well as the sheer number of individually uninvolved instances of crime in general, if not violent crime, between my generation and my father's. Now, there are a number of significant milestones, and I'm calling them milestones, which kind of makes them sound positive, but really I just mean items that created change throughout the course of American history. And Columbine also marks one of those movements, when crime took a front seat in the news and basically frightened the nation for the sheer, I'll call it, determination of the murderers. Of the murders and the murderers in question. And this is one of the instances I think, from my best guess, it felt after Columbine in the 90s probably like what a horrific murder felt like in the 50s, because it really grabbed the nation. I mean, it was 2 or 3 boys dressed in trench coats and came in, just shot a bunch of kids. I mean, they just lined them up, ruthlessly murdered them, then shot themselves at the end. I think the trench coat mafia was born of that. I mean, it was in the news for months. If you weren't alive, if you're in my listening audience and you weren't alive for that, it was, I don't know what, a recent, probably like, I don't know if it's to the extent of 9/11, because 9/11 had a global impact, and I think Columbine was more or less limited to news in the States, but and perhaps developing world, or the, what do you call it, the first world countries of the world. I'm not really sure if I can think of one for the millennial generation that would have been that impactful. But in any case, it was a big one. I'll suffice it to say for this conversation that crime encroached further into personal experiences as I grew up. This next generation, obviously they've seen shootings and violent crimes rise even further, making Columbine kind of look more like a stepping stone than an isolated incident in recent history. And I think shootings became more prevalent outside of schools as well. Community organizations, places of like religious congregation, places of commerce like malls and grocery stores and things like that. They've all literally come under fire by those attempting to perpetrate a great deal of harm and horror on their neighbors. It's unfortunate though that maybe there has to be more of a prevalence now. I just don't recall in my research finding shootings from the 70s climbing to the numbers that they are today. And I actually am aware of the difference that media uses to, I don't know, scare people into staying glued to their screens, between that and what the actual numbers truly are, because there's a lot that's skewed out there, but that doesn't, I don't think, whitewash in the last 50 years the increase in number of mass shootings recently. And again, this is just one aspect that separates my generation from my father's, the sheer intentionality of acts of violent crime. And that it just continues to increase. These facts were intended to either provoke some kind of a localized response or simply exact carnage before committing suicide. I think in those instances, there were a lot of other intentions behind mass killings, of course. But I've covered some of those in the research that I've done in previous articles, and you're welcome to check those out. I'll link these in the article. Moving forward, ever since 9/11, when the world was basically shattered by the crumbling towers in New York City, nothing has ever been the same. This was a huge mark in not just American history, but the entire world. I mean, nobody has stepped on an airplane since 9/11 and not felt the effects of what happened in America. And you can you can either thank terrorists or the U.S. government's involvement with terrorists, to take the World Trade Centers down. I have my own opinion of this, and I know it's going to make me sound like a conspiracy theorist, and perhaps I suppose it might be. But in 1993, the FBI was basically outed for trying to pay an Egyptian guy to park a bomb with explosives in front of the FBI, in front of the World Trade Center tower that first went down. And in the basement of that tower was a huge cache of gold, which later, if I'm correct in my recollection of media that I watched around that time, George Bush Jr. Basically said the gold was vaporized. And if we're talking about a huge cache at the base of the World Trade Center, that might be worth killing, 3,000 people, in the FBI's eyes, or the IRS's eyes, or the Fed in general. I would find it interesting to see if facts were revealed that pointed to that, but I'm going to get back off my soapbox and onto this thing. In other words, I guess what I'm saying in all of this is there's a new era of antitrust that ushered in around that time, and a culture that was once free to assume innocence before guilt started down the path of a paradigm shift that resulted in what we see now, like what we see in headlines today and certainly in society. Long waiting lines at TSA checkpoints for commercial flights, metal detectors at courts and schools. Of course, police stations are basically locked down. I don't know the last time I went to a police station to do something, but I do recall standing in front of one-way mirrored glass, even on the outside. So there's also been a flurry of background checks and interview points for otherwise innocuous jobs. And kind of general access to places. I'm more aware of this because I come from the teaching profession, but and I'm sure it happens in other professions as well. What it all boils down to, I think, is that these days we finally have to take the news seriously. And obviously I have been critical of the media in the past, but in skewing the facts, in sort of not reporting on race issues, in whitewashing a lot of things from both the left and the right, there is still a story there, and that story is much scarier. If any, I don't know, you take 1 week in American history between 2010 and right now, and you let's say you could transport that back in time to the 1950s and put those headlines in newspapers across America, I think people would freak out. I mean, they're just not. In 1 week, we experience a flurry of headlines that would, I think, send people into chaos around the country, not knowing what to do about all of this. But here's the anecdotal comparison that drives my point. Within a couple of years of first getting my license, way back, I think I know I was 16. I can't remember if it was my own car. My mom was married to this guy who was trying to impress her and bought everybody, cars and stuff. I think I might have been the recipient of one such vehicle. I had gotten a flat tire, and so I had pulled off to the side of the road. I was in the middle of changing that tire. I knew how to change a tire for longer than I knew how to drive. I was changing that tire, and a cop pulled up behind me with his lights on. And at that time, I just expected, I didn't really think much outside of myself, but I was changing a tire, and I thought, oh crap, my radar went up, but I kind of more or less assumed that he was just going to park behind me and leave his lights on so that nobody ran into me. I'm going to apologize that I am no longer speaking directly through my mouth, but also through my nose, which has become kind of I don't even know what is going on. I don't have allergies, but all of a sudden I found myself sniffling, so I apologize about that. Anyway, so there I am. I'm pulled over on the side of the road. He pulls up behind me with his lights on. I wasn't necessarily alarmed. I was cautious of an interaction with a police officer, but I wasn't altogether worried about what would happen. In fact, I feel like I was right to be both, calm and concerned at that time, just because what the expectations were at that time for cops. But as part of his job description at the time, which has certainly changed, the officer, he stopped behind me. He got out of his vehicle. He sort of steered perpendicular to stop something that might hit, a swerving vehicle or something like that would hit my vehicle. And he actually helped. He actually got out. He walked to the front. I gave him my attention. He was like, "Hey, how's it going there?" He saw I was a teenager probably. And, he actually went to his car. I had one of these like standard, it came with the car type, tool set. And my tire iron was pretty frail looking. He went back to his car and got a much bigger one. And he said, this is the one you want to buy. Next time you go to the store, you don't want this little piece of crap that comes with your, sits in the boot with your spare donut tire. He kind of taught me and helped me, and he wasn't even that old. I mean, I don't recall him being like a super fatherly type of cop, but he just helped me do this thing, and it was an interesting experience. These days, if a cop stops, you actually have a measurable statistical probability that interaction could end with you being shot. Cops don't approach people on the side of the road today like they did. And these days, I think cops have, as proven in lots of instances, cops have no actual professional obligation to assist anyone in any way, even if that effort could result in saving that person's life. I think I read a case last week on a guy who, he wasn't, I think he might have been like leaving the cops, but he wasn't running from the cops. He gets in a river and starts swimming across, but that river was like, I don't think he could actually swim. I think he assumed that the river was like shallow. And then when he got to a place where his feet wouldn't touch, he went below the surface, and the cops just sat there and watched him drown. They didn't dive in. They didn't do anything. They basically admitted right there on the spot, if my memory serves correctly, that they're under no obligation to help him. And I think there are examples all over the world, really, where there's proof available. Thankfully, we haven't descended into the depths where all officers kind of remember and exercise their freedom to refuse life-saving services. But the difference between my experience as a new driver in my teen years and the experience new drivers are having on the road today with police officers generally is very telling of how trust in law enforcement has been diminished. So getting back on track here, if you Google a term like police-involved shootings, you'll see seemingly endless pages of results of officers being fired or even charged with murder or murder-related crimes. And I think yet, while these cases are prevalent, there are other, I think, even more numerous cases of officers who should have been charged but weren't. And I think this is often the result of technicalities that are stitched in the law in most states to protect officers and, frankly, grant them additional rights over the citizens they serve. And if you think I'm wrong about that, I'm happy to put research in the article. Shoot me your comments and let me know. I'm happy to give you some resources for that. Things shouldn't be this way. That's what it comes down to. That complexity that I referenced before, it has contributed to issues on both sides of this debate. And while it may be true that there are knowable solutions lingering out there in the ether, it's certainly not known to us right now. And case by case, we're seeing charges either dropped or refused for bad officers entangled in extremely questionable violent crimes, where convictions for good officers, on the other hand, are also easily found on headlines around the nation. Both of those are troubling statistics, and it just shouldn't be this way. The only easy answer that covers all the chaotic rubble of the debate is that there is no easy answer. There's no way to sum it all up. There's no way to come to a quick decision that blanket answers every single case of every single state, while simultaneously including both sides of the argument and also offering a semblance of peace to the victims that find themselves in the fray. I think that's just something that we can all pretty much agree on. I'll go on record once again and say that we absolutely do need good cops. Like, I am very much in favor of good cops doing good work for their communities. I, for one, have always supported that. I've come in defense of good officers when good officers have performed their duties in earnest, I think is the right description there. They're serving their communities, and I think most cops join with that at heart. But I think that as a result of the exposure that cops have had lately for their involvement in killing innocent victims, young men these days are a lot less likely to choose policing over other careers. And that it's going to continue having an effect, and has already had an effect on I think that's another one of these complex items that contributes to the statistics that we're seeing now. And don't get me wrong, I'm not so ignorant that I don't think police killings have never been the case up until people started filming police. I mean, the filming of police really is one of the few catalysts that actually hold police to account. So much so that now departments are finally requiring their officers to be recording themselves any and all times on duty. Even the county I live in, the sheriffs are not required to film their entire 8-hour shift, but they are required to record the moment that an incident is either witnessed or they're called to, and when they arrive on the scene. So there are positive changes, there are negative changes, and I think every one of us is currently finding ourselves in the midst of huge change. I'm hoping that there's a lot of hopes I have. How do I pinpoint one? I hope that there are more people that don't shy away from becoming cops because of this, and that more cops, or more people that would be cops, bring to the table diversity and opinions and backgrounds that hold up, I think, the original principles of why police officers formed. Thanks so much for listening. That's it for this edition of Legally Insane News. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell for updates and extras on this and other stories. If you're listening to this podcast at legallyinsanefilms.com or the Small Town Justice page, be sure to also download the Spreaker app, where you can directly subscribe and help me bump up my download totals. If you like this episode of Legally Insane News, consider becoming a supporting member. For just $3, you can get access to members-only unreleased articles and podcasts, case files on our latest investigations, updates for events and conventions that we're attending, and discounts on swag. To do that, just head over to patreon.com/legallyinsanefilms.
There are 3 different memberships, each with more content than the one before. This is where I release all of my documentary films with outtakes and extras, as well as another podcast called Small Town Justice. You can check those out by going to legallyinsanefilms.com and clicking Join the Fan Club. Send any questions, comments, feedback, and show ideas to thejusticepod@gmail.com. This has been a production of Legally Insane Films, LLC. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time.